Hi. I'd like to take a bit of a detour from Westminster politics and instead talk to you today about financial vulnerability in government debt, and specifically what we in Indesser are doing to use data and analytics to identify vulnerable customers. The topic of vulnerability, I'm sure, won't be a new one to anyone in the room, and you may even recognize some of the quotes on the wall behind me. They represent a fraction of what regulators, government departments, and industry are saying about vulnerability. Working in the debt industry, as I do, puts us very close to vulnerable customers, and I describe it as we have a high likelihood of interacting with these customers, as well as a high risk of detriment if we're not working in the right way. But our position also gives us a tremendous opportunity to effect some real change. So before I go any further in the presentation, I just want to give a bit of background on who Indesser are and what we do. So Indesser are a joint venture between TDX Group, a private sector debt specialist, and the Cabinet Office. We were set up in 2015, and since then we've been providing a wide range of debt management services to government and to the wider public sector. Okay. Our approach, if you like, to debt resolution can be simplified into the following 4 stages. So firstly, a government department will pass us a file of in-debt customers. Secondly, we'll use a range of data sources to enrich that file, understand that customer's circumstances, and what the most appropriate treatment path is to resolve their debt. Thirdly, the customers will be passed to one of our panel of debt collection agencies to execute that strategy, which will lead to resolution of the debt. To date, most of our effort in vulnerability and addressing vulnerability has been focused on this part, and for good reason, because this is where collections agents working on our behalf actually interact with customers. But the challenge for me and for my team was, what can we do with data to drive better interactions and hence better outcomes for vulnerable customers? Can we do anything? And because I'm a strong believer in the power of data, I said, yes, of course we can do something here. And the seed of an idea in my head was, surely we must be able to use data and intelligence to identify customers that we believe are vulnerable. And if we could do that, then what different treatment paths can we design that are better suited to those customers' needs? So to start to turn that intention into some results, we did a lot of research, a lot of reading. And one of the things we found was this, from the 4 characteristics of potential vulnerability that the FCA talk about in a number of their publications. And looking at this, what we quickly realized is that we have a lot more data on these 2 characteristics than we do on these 2. And so in order to deliver a data-led solution, we decided to focus on financial capability and financial resilience. And so when you hear me talking about financial vulnerability, it's those 2 characteristics in particular I'm talking about. Okay. So we have the challenge. We've now got the scope. What we need to do is crack on and build a model, right? Well, the slight challenge is that when we look at our historic data that we typically use to build a model, we don't know exactly who's vulnerable and who's not. And the reason we don't is because we don't speak to every customer. In fact, the research tells us we're less likely to speak to vulnerable customers than we are other customers. So for you model build enthusiasts out there, what that means is we don't have a really crisp dependent variable. So we can't use regression techniques, for instance, to build a model. So what did we do instead? So we went back to the data. The team scoured over 150 credit bureau characteristics to identify links between those data points and financial vulnerability. And they did so with their experience and knowledge, and also the data points we do have available. Contacts, vulnerability where we have identified it, as well as some department-specific data points. And what they found was these 6 behaviors that we think show indication of financial vulnerability. So the first, poor management of the basics, is a really good example of how we can use data to identify financial capability specifically. So an example of that is an individual who might use an overdraft for relatively low value borrowing, right? Particularly where that's an unauthorized overdraft use, and particularly where they have other cheaper options available. Secondly, high utilization of credit points very clearly to low financial resilience. For instance, a customer who's at or above the credit limit across their credit cards. So I won't speak in detail about the other 4 behaviours, apart from to say that we've got a really good balance, I think, of leading indicators that show how a customer is behaving in the present and how that links to vulnerability, as well as lagging indicators, so an indication of what someone's done in the past that points to their likelihood of vulnerability in the present. From these behaviours, the team defined 18 signals of financial vulnerability, so 18 specific examples of those behaviours that we coded up, and then set a threshold where when we see 3 or more of these signals, we will, in this model, define that individual as financially vulnerable. And after creating this, the question for me was, and the slightly nerve-wracking question is we couldn't use standard model build techniques, was how well does this work? What kind of customers might this model identify? I've not got a ton of time to show lots of analyses or charts, but I just want to show 4 numbers that I think answer that question. So this model identifies 5% of a typical debt portfolio as being financially vulnerable. We are 60% less likely to speak to customers in that segment. They are 80% less likely to make a payment. And when we look at liquidation rate, so the proportion of the debt that's paid back, that's 90% lower. Or we put it another way, we're less likely to speak to these customers. The ones that we do speak to are less likely to pay, and the ones that do pay can only pay back less. So I think that tells me that we're onto something with this model. But how do we use it? So I'm super excited to put this model to use in our collection strategies. But of course, it's not just the model and the segmentation that's important, it's the collection strategy that we pair with that that's really key. And we currently have a tender in the market to identify those suppliers who can deliver that right treatment path for this customer group. Even while that work is going on, the team is super excited about where we go next with this, with the model build specifically. And for me, the biggest opportunity is to broaden out the model to include all 4 characteristics of vulnerability, looking at data on health and major life events. So very sensitive data sets. And I think, therefore, the challenge for us is how do we use that data, those various data sources, in a way that's legal, in a way that's ethical, and in a way that genuinely improves outcomes for financially vulnerable customers. Thank you very much for listening.
So we are on the record for questions, so please do be aware of that. If you give your name and where you're from and keep your sort of questions nice and short, because I will start the timer as soon as the first question is asked. We will try to take questions in groups of 2 or 3. So any questions for Oli? We've got one down the front here. We've got one at the back there. Let's start with those 2.
Okay, thanks. Julie Pearce from the Food Standards Agency. So we have a hypothesis that for food businesses, particularly where they're SMEs, there's a correlation between poor financial performance as a lead indicator for poor food safety performance. And I'm just wondering whether you would be interested in exploring that hypothesis with us.
Thank you. And then at the back, and if you could wait for the mics to come to you if you're asked a question.
Hi there, my name is Bradley Carter-Roberts from the Treasury. I just wanted to ask whether you could give some examples of some of the treatment packages that you refer to, just to help me understand.
Thank you.
Thank you. And was it Julie? Yes. Julie. So yes, absolutely. We'd be interested in exploring where we can use data to identify department-specific concerns like food standards. We think there's great crossover where I think the point you're making, if I may paraphrase, is that data in one area can be really helpful for another. We are, I think, as an organisation, don't you think, we are advocates of data sharing where that's of benefit to departments. So yes, that would be something that we're very interested in. And I'm really sorry, was it Paddy or? Bradley. Yes. Bradley, sorry. Bradley, your question was around examples of treatment paths. Yeah, so it's a great question. 8 minutes is a very short time to get a presentation to, so that's something I had to drop out. As I say, we've launched a tender into the market for suppliers to give us what they think the strategy should be. We are keen to listen to the market and hear what their ideas are. But of course, we're going into that tender with an idea of the rough size and shape of what we think the right answer should be. And I'll give you a few, let me give you probably 3 categories of where we'll be looking for what we think that right answer is. The first category is in the commercial model. Most of the debt industry, or the received wisdom in the debt industry is to work on a commission basis, where the agencies get paid as a percentage of collections, which has a lot of pros, has some cons, particularly when we're dealing with vulnerable customers, though. That doesn't feel like the right model at all. So we're looking for some kind of alternative model there. Secondly, the look and feel of the communications is a really key factor. So we've had some really interesting, or heard some really interesting results in using wording in the letters that is around, I want to speak to you. I want to understand your circumstances, as opposed to letters that are written in the form of, "Sheet, you've missed this payment, can you please pay?" And not saying those letters are wrong, but you need to get the right letter to the right customer's circumstance. And I said 3 areas. So the third area is around the kind of length of strategy. So again, one of the conventions in the debt industry is that there's a certain amount of time within which we can resolve that customer situation. When that time elapses, it's elapsed. But when we're dealing with customers who have very complex situations that we need time to understand, those time limits start to make a bit less sense. And so we'll be looking for suppliers to show an understanding of how that can be varied and how that can, how those time limits can be suited to the individual circumstance.
Next set of questions. We've got one over there. We've got one down here. Any others? Might have time for another round. Great.
Thanks for the presentation. Really fascinating to hear about a great use of data to make people's lives better. You said that there were 4 characteristics of data vulnerability, but have majored on 2. So I wonder if you could comment on the virtues and validity of the models that come when you're ignoring 2 significant characteristics. And in particular, whether the 6 behaviours, that was the language you used,
yes,
can be used as proxies for the 2 things that you're overlooking in any sense.
Okay, thank you. And then down here in the 3rd row.
Paul Daly, GBG. Having worked with you guys, I know you do quite a lot in this area. It was just interesting on the 6 characteristics from the 150 sets and credit data. I just thought, looking at vulnerable customers, have you thought about using data other than credit? Things like transactional data, purchase data, retail data, mobile phone data. A lot of those people may not have a credit footprint or a poor credit footprint. So it'd be useful to know what other data other than credit you guys might look at.
Great, thank you.
Data. I'm really sorry I didn't catch your name at the start of that.
Sorry, yes, I realised it. Joe Baker from Kimberley.
Joe, hi, thank you for your question. Yeah, it's a great point. The FCA talk about these 4 characteristics of potential vulnerability. Yeah, we focused on only 2. That feels like a bit of a gap. I've stylised them as 4 boxes because it goes with our PowerPoint theme. If you look at the FCA's publications on the topic, they do a very amazing 4-way Venn diagram showing that from their research, there's huge overlap, as you'd probably expect, from customers that might have had major life events, health, and therefore financial resilience and capability. So when you look at that Venn diagram, I've not got the stats exactly in my head, but covering the 2 financial characteristics gives us a very more than 50% coverage of customers who, in the FCA's research, they're identified as vulnerable. So I'd say that we do have some visibility of those other two characteristics as my first point. But there will be some customers who we're missing. I say customers, I come from a private sector background, service users is maybe the correct term, who we may be missing. And I think, as to my point right at the end of the presentation there, I think that is a gap that it would be really exciting to try and fill. I know that Equifax have been trying to work with charities to identify if there's a way to opt in to share your data that you might be undergoing a serious health issue or major life event that can be used to your benefit, for instance, holding you out of debt collection activities as well as other uses. So I definitely see that as a kind of version 2 improvement. Paul, thank you for your question. I think it kind of links to the previous question in that there are other sources of data out there that we would like to use. So I think you're absolutely right to identify those categories where we could build that understanding. My rough perspective on this is I'm a fan of putting something live and learning from that. So while the model doesn't cover all the bases we might like it to, it'd be really interesting to put that live, communicate with those 5% of customers that are most at risk of vulnerability in a different way, see what conversations we have with them and learn from that, and for instance, what other data sources we can take on board. So again, a definite version 2 thing that we want to include.
Fantastic. We've got 20 seconds left if anybody wants to get an incredibly quick question.
Very quick.
Otherwise, I'll ask one very final one. We ask our speakers some questions before they come on as well. If there's one thing you could change about government data, what would you do? You've got 5 seconds.
I think really quickly, I think it comes back to Julie's question, making data sharing when it's for the benefit of the customer built in rather than a quite difficult thing to do afterwards. That would be my one thing.
Great. Oli, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Gavin.